a difficult film to watch because of the legacy it's left with us.
As soon as I saw him put on the blackface, I thought, when in the history of our country did it become non-political to be blackface? We accepted that very easily, but as it moved on, at some point, you would never do that today. When did that kind of stop?
It's a very astute observation. One thing that, again, many people have said about the jazz singer is that the heyday of blackface was actually the middle of the 19th century. And by the time that we see it here in 27, blackface was really on its way out. And so it's interesting that other, again, Jewish performers, Eddie Cantor, Sophie Tucker, were doing blackface as part of their routine. So it was multiple Jewish performers doing this. But you're right, it was definitely, as we might term today, it was already becoming not PC, but still being used by certain people in this time period.
So Warren, you've talked about what the Jews have been doing in this era and having blackface. What was the role of the African American community at that time on film, if any?
Well, again, sadly, for most African Americans, if they got a chance to perform on the screen during this time, it was still in very stereotypical roles as maids and servants. One thing that intersects with this time period, 1927 was not only the year of the jazz singer, it was the year that the musical Showboat came out. And so it's interesting to think about those two pieces. It comes out on Broadway, and then a few years later it's made into a film. But again, the idea of black stevedores and people working in kitchens, it was still a moment of Butterfly McQueen and Hattie McDaniel working, not always being given the chance to really have really in-depth roles.
Warren, it's not clear in the clips that you showed the dilemma that Robbins was really feeling, because for looking at it, it wasn't clear by being the jazz singer how it conflicted with his Jewish background. Can you elaborate on that?
Sure. I know we're looking at very quick clips tonight, but his father wants him to basically succeed him in the role of cantor at the synagogue. And especially as his father takes ill later in the movie, it's the question of who is going to sing or pray the Kol Nidre service. And so the night that he has to go on, that Jack has to go on, it's also, of course, as in film, the same night as Yom Kippur. And only in the movies, he works it out where he gets to sing both Kol Nidre and gets to make it, you know, to the stage and to become a star. So that's really the tension that's going on, that his father wants him to follow in his footsteps and he doesn't want to. But what's, I think, particularly interesting is that jazz, and this is where the movie begins, jazz becomes the new type of prayer for the American Jew. So that's another way in which all these themes are connected.
So Warren, why is film such a good medium to explore these kinds of relationships between different ethnic and racial groups?
Well, film is a great medium because it's a medium of preservation. And, you know, doing history, I think it's very difficult at times to, of course, think back or actually be there. We don't have a time machine. And even though, of course, films are, they are staged, they are fictional, they're based on the moments in which they are produced. And so there are great ways of at least getting a sense of the issues that were concerning different groups at the time, and we can try to get closer to that moment ourselves.
Well, Warren, thank you, and thanks to our audience as well, because they asked some really perceptive questions that I think helped us to gain even more insight about what was going on, what some of the nuances were in that film. So we now move a little bit further forward in history. We've got some more film clips to look at, so I am going to turn it right back over to Warren Hoffman. Here he is.
Well, now we are indeed going to jump forward in history to the film Liberty Heights. And the film itself is from 1999, written and directed by Barry Levinson. But the film takes place in Baltimore in 1954, right after the moment of Brown versus the Board of Education, which allowed for the integration of school systems. And that's really what this film is about. It takes place in Liberty Heights, the Jewish section of Baltimore, and focuses on Ben Kurtzman, a young Jewish-American high schooler and his friends, and someone new in his class, a young African-American girl named Sylvia. And the film is about their relationship together and how they try to understand each other. So the first clip we're going to look at is from the very beginning of the film, and it's actually two short sequences. The first is Ben remembering an incident when he is a young child at a friend's house, and the second fast forwards to the then present when Ben is with some friends outside a private swim club, and we'll see what happens to them there.
Is there something wrong, Ben?
No, this is fine. I just never had raw bread before.
What?
We always cook it. You know, toast it.
Oh, I can do that.
No, there's too much white here. The milk is white. The bread is white. It's all white stuff.
Well, what do you normally have?
Not this.
What was on the bread?
Luncheon meat. I've never heard of it.
Not bologna? Not salami?
No, luncheon meat with mayonnaise and milk. Everything was white.
Wow, they must not be Jewish. They're the other kind.
Boiler, they told me to shovel more coal in the boiler, but that don't do.
How do you think they came up with that order?
What?
That the Jews should be first.
Yeah, I would have thought it'd be dogs, coloreds, then Jews.
There must have been some meeting to come up with that. Because some guy, you know, he had to say, I have to tell you, the Jews bother me more than the dogs.
So now a dog goes there. Does he read the sign and leave?
I definitely would have put the dogs first. A dog can take a piss. You're walking barefoot. On the other hand, a Jew is not going to lift his leg and pee on the wall.
So these two mini sequences are very much interrelated, and they both have to do with the shifting identity and the shifting racial identity of Jews in the 1950s. The first moment, again, Ben thinks that he's growing up in this Jewish section and thinks that the whole world is Jewish, and whites is sort of the other, right? And the film comically sets up as Jewishness as something apart from white identity. But when we jump to this second part where they're at the swim club, Jews are not seen as white, right? They're being lumped with African Americans and most disgustedly with dogs. Everybody's put into that category. But at the same time, if you listen to what Ben and his friends have to say, they see themselves as apart from the African American community. And so depending on the context, the racial nature of Jews seems to switch. And it's interesting to see how that plays out in the course of this film. We're going to jump to a second section much later on in which Ben and his friends and Sylvia and her friends have actually been kidnapped by a character named Little Melvin. Little Melvin is owed some money by Ben's father, who runs a numbers game on the side, and he hasn't been able to pay Little Melvin. So Little Melvin, out of retaliation, has kidnapped Ben and his friends, and we're going to see what transpires.
My father had the money, he'd give it to you.
Two black, two white. Y'all dating?
No.
We happen to meet. Ben, Sheldon, and I go to the same school.
I go to Douglas.
Cab Calloway went to Douglas.
Something going on between you two?
Ah, we're just friends.
Friends? White guy, colored girl friends? I ain't never heard of such a thing.
New to me, too.
You plugging her?
No.
Well, why not? She good looking.
We're just friends.
I ain't never had a white friend in my entire life. Now, I done worked for white, and I've been messed over by white. But we ain't never been friends. And I don't get a chance to be in the business world like you Jews, neither.
Jews are a minority, too, you know.
Oh, that's so.
Yeah. Did you know that there are less Jews in the world than Negroes?
Yeah? But you ain't got the skin thing. Slaves? Slaves.
Jews were slaves.
Bullshit.
Who built the pyramids?
How in the hell should I know?
The Jews.
The Jews. The Jews built the pyramids?
I didn't know that.
Pull them big stones, Jews.
It's true.
When was that?
3,500 years ago, something like that?
3,500 years ago? Don't you tell me that no slave thing happened 3,500 years ago. I'm talking about my granddaddy was a slave. Thousands of years ago, dinosaurs roamed the earth and stuff was still coming up out of the dirt.
What?
Don't you make fun of my suffering.
So again, a lot of different things happening in this sequence. When it begins, little Melvin, again, positions Ben and his friends, his Jewish friends, as white, right? There are the whites and the blacks in this scene. And we would think that that would be okay with Ben and his friends, but we see how he sort of manipulates the situation, right? And when he needs to, he wants to cast Jews as a minority, right? We are a minority too. But little Melvin is definitely correct. He says, but you ain't got the skin thing, right? And that's something that's very important here, that in American society, though there are similarities between these two groups, that skin color has also shaped how people are treated in our society. So there's that's going on. There is, of course, also that comparison with slavery, right? And Jews said, we were slaves as well. But again, little Melvin has the upper hand because he is correct in saying, how can you compare these very disparate moments in time? That the legacy of slavery in America is still very much impacting African American life. And to compare that with what happened thousands of years ago for the Jews seems to be, I would say, even a little farcical. So it's interesting to see the similarities and yet also major differences between these two groups.
Well, thank you, Warren. That film certainly gives us a whole different angle to explore the relationship between these two groups. And we've got some questions now from our studio audience.
Hi, Warren. Welcome back to Temple Shalom. Nice to see you again. A bigger picture question for you. I wonder if you have any thoughts on why in America, the land of immigrants, there is so much animosity and virulent hatred and racism between different groups in this country.
Well, it's definitely a complicated question that has no easy answers. Some people might argue that the history of race and immigrants in this country is a lot about always vying sort of who's going to take different sort of places in society. And one might say that, and we're seeing that in this film here, that Jews are trying to become white, and they're trying to ascend in society, right? And the question of, and their relationship will be directly in context with African Americans, that by sort of putting somebody else down, it actually allows them to rise. And I think it's a sad example of what's happened, but it's I think seen throughout our history at times about trying to keep other people in one place as a way to succeed themselves.
Hi, Warren. I've always been curious about why Jews were considered black, and I think that historically has been the case in many places, and I wondered if you could shed any light on that.
It's a good and complicated question. I don't think it's so much that Jews were considered to be black in the same way that African Americans were considered to be black. It was more an issue that Jews were not considered to be white. And what that means is that the idea of whiteness has changed in America over the course of the 20th century. Particularly at the beginning of the 20th century, white really was synonymous with Anglo-Saxon, that idea being WASP. And what happens over the course of the 20th century is that the category of whiteness expands, and it allows immigrant groups like Jews, Italian immigrants, Jews who were not seen Irish, who were not seen as part of that Anglo-Saxon group, to become part of a wider category of whiteness. And what happens again, not only is that happening, but race seems to divide more or less into two major categories, not all these different categories, but between white and black. And that's what happens over the course of the 20th century, and often sort of, I would say, where we are still today.
Warren, I think that you said that the film Liberty Heights was filmed in the 1990s, and I still find that rather provocative 20, 30 years after the Civil Rights Movement began. So I'd like to ask, was it a successful film at the box office?
As far as I know, the film did well critically. I don't think it was a huge hit in terms of a blockbuster, but Barry Levinson, the writer director, all of his films are sort of about recapturing different moments in Jewish American